It was supposed to be an ordinary dinner, quiet, warm, filled with the sound of plates and spoons. But that night, silence became sharper than words. My son looked at my plate, frowned, and pushed it aside. He laughed and said, "Old people eat last." Everyone else at the table laughed too, but I didn't. My hands froze, my throat closed, and the room suddenly felt smaller. I didn't speak, didn't defend myself. I just looked at the plate that once fed him when he was small. And I smiled. The kind of smile that hides storms. That night, I didn't sleep. I only planned breakfast. I'm glad you're here, because this isn't just a story about hunger. It's about memory, dignity, and quiet revenge. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe, and listen till the end. Because some meals are not made of food. They're made of lessons. Dinner had always been a quiet time in our home, the one moment of the day when peace felt possible. The table was small but full of memories. The same table where I once fed my son with my hands when he was too little to hold a spoon. The same table where we had laughed through hard times, shared stories, and found warmth even when the world outside was cold. That night, I had cooked his favorite dish, hoping it might bring back a little of that old closeness. But I didn't know that closeness had already died. He came home late, his face tired, but his tone sharp. His wife followed him, her perfume filling the air before her words did. The house no longer felt like mine. It was just walls. Just space I moved through quietly, like a shadow waiting to be noticed. I set the table as I always did, carefully, neatly, the way he liked it when he was a boy. There were 4 plates, one for him, one for his wife, one for me, and one for the quiet in between. The food smelled warm, comforting, and the steam rose like a prayer. But as soon as they sat down, I felt it. The tension, the distance. His wife scrolled on her phone while I placed the last dish on the table. My son didn't look at me. He started serving himself first, piling food onto his plate. I waited, as I always did, hoping he'd ask me to eat. When he didn't, I quietly reached for my plate. That's when it happened. He pushed my plate away. Not roughly, but with that cold, careless motion that hurts more than force ever could. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. He said, "Old people eat last." For a moment, everything stopped. The clink of cutlery, the hum of the fan. Even the laughter from the television in the background went quiet in my mind. I froze, my hands still, my heart heavy. The words didn't just hurt. They erased years of love in 1 second. He didn't even notice. He kept eating, talking to his wife, who laughed softly, almost proud. I sat there, looking at my empty plate, my appetite gone. The smell of food that once made me feel loved now made me sick. I wanted to ask him if he remembered the nights I had stayed awake when he was sick, spoon-feeding him because he couldn't swallow. I wanted to ask if he remembered when he used to push food toward me, saying, "You eat first, Mama." But I didn't. I stayed silent. Silence is what mothers do when words would only fall on deaf ears. I looked at his face, older now, but still the same boy I once held against my chest when he cried over scraped knees. But now that boy was gone. What sat in front of me was a man who saw his mother not as a blessing, but as a burden. And the woman beside him, his wife, smiled as if this cruelty was a joke shared between equals. I could feel the sting of tears, but I didn't let them fall. Tears are mercy, and that night I had none left to give. I sat still, the sound of forks and spoons scraping plates louder than thunder in my ears. I looked around the table, the food untouched on my side, the laughter echoing from theirs. My hands trembled slightly. I placed them in my lap, folding them tight to hide the shaking. The air in the room grew heavy. I felt every breath like it was work. Every second stretched long and sharp. The candle flickered weakly, its flame bending with every laugh they shared. That table, once sacred, had turned into a stage for humiliation. I had never imagined that love could turn into something so cruel, so casual. I wasn't just hurt. I was erased, treated like furniture that didn't belong anymore. I lowered my eyes and pretended to adjust the napkin, just to avoid their faces. The smell of curry and rice mixed with the scent of shame. I could hear their voices fade into background noise, my thoughts louder than anything they said. I thought of the years I had spent cooking at that same stove, every meal seasoned with care, every bite made from sacrifice. I remembered skipping meals during the lean years so that he would never go to bed hungry. I remembered saving the smallest pieces of meat for him, saying I wasn't hungry, even when I was. And now, the same child I had fed before myself had told me I didn't deserve to eat. I stared at the plate that had been pushed aside. The small silver rim caught the light and reflected a part of my face. The wrinkles, the sadness, the fatigue. It looked like a stranger's face. I didn't recognize myself anymore. He looked up once, briefly, and saw me sitting still, not touching my food. But he said nothing. He went back to his meal, his laughter louder this time, as if to bury my silence. His wife whispered something, and they both laughed again. That sound was crueler than the words had been. After dinner, they left the table without clearing it. I sat there a little longer, staring at the food going cold, at the crumbs that clung to the edge of the table. My plate remained untouched. The room smelled like leftovers and pride. When they finally went to their room, I gathered the plates, one by one. I washed them quietly, each dish clinking softly against the sink. A rhythm of habit, of years spent cleaning up after everyone else. My hands were steady now, though my heart wasn't. I dried each plate carefully, even the one that had been pushed aside. Old habits die hard. I placed the clean dishes back in the cupboard, turned off the kitchen light, and walked to my room. The hallway felt longer than usual, every step echoing the emptiness inside me. When I reached my bed, I sat on the edge, staring at my hands, hands that had built, served, comforted, sacrificed. Hands that had once held him through every fever, every fear. And now those same hands were shaking not from age, but from humiliation. I lay down, but sleep refused to come. The house was quiet, but my mind was loud. The words kept replaying. Old people eat last. It wasn't the sentence that hurt most. It was the belief behind it. That I had somehow become less than him, that my existence, once his foundation, was now an inconvenience. I turned on my side and stared at the shadow of the curtains swaying in the faint breeze. I could still hear the faint sound of their laughter from the other room. And as I lay there in the dark, something changed inside me. It wasn't anger. Anger burns fast and leaves ash. This was something deeper. A cold, clear understanding. The kind of understanding that comes only after too many years of being quiet. I realized I had spent my life feeding everyone else. With food, with love, with time. And now I was the one starving. Not from hunger, but from absence. the absence of respect, of gratitude, of simple kindness. So I stopped crying. I stopped remembering. I stopped wishing things would go back to what they were. Instead, I started thinking about tomorrow, about morning. I sat up, turned on the small lamp beside my bed, and looked around my room. The walls were filled with photographs, birthdays, graduations, weddings. His smile in every one, my pride, my reason. But now, they felt like lies. Pictures of a story that no longer existed. I took a deep breath and whispered softly to myself, "Enough." The word felt strange, but powerful. It was the first word of strength I had spoken in years. I didn't know what I would do yet, but I knew I wouldn't stay silent anymore. Not through shouting or fighting, but through something quieter, sharper. Truth. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the moon climb higher. The world outside looked peaceful, untouched by the cruelty inside my home. I watched the stars, my heart heavy, but my eyes dry. And for the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt awake. Morning would come, and with it, a lesson that would not be forgotten. That night I didn't sleep. I only planned breakfast. When I was young, life never gave me much, but it gave me one reason to keep going: my son. I lost my husband early, before we could build the life we dreamed of. The house we lived in was small, with a tin roof that leaked when it rained, but it was warm because his laughter filled it. Every sound of him running across the floor, every smile he gave me, that was my wealth. I promised myself I would give him everything I never had, even if it meant going hungry, even if it meant breaking myself in half. I worked long hours doing whatever I could find, stitching clothes, cleaning houses, washing dishes in other people's kitchens. My hands grew rough, my back bent early, but my heart never complained. Every coin I earned, I saved for him. Every meal, I made sure his plate was full before I took a bite. I told myself hunger was temporary, but his future had to be permanent. Our kitchen back then was tiny. A single stove, an old wooden table, and one cracked window that let in more dust than light. But it was the center of our world. The smell of rice and lentils was our comfort. He would sit beside me on the floor while I cooked, asking questions about everything. I remember the way his small hands would hold my sari, tugging gently, asking when the food would be ready. When it was, he always pushed the plate toward me first, saying, "Mom, you eat first." I'd smile, pretending to take a bite, but I always made sure he ate until his stomach was full. That memory used to be my peace. There were nights when I didn't eat at all, not because there wasn't food, but because I wanted him to dream without worry. Hunger became my quiet companion, but I never let him know. Mothers hide their hunger better than they hide their tears. I remember the winters most clearly, when the cold would creep through the cracks in the walls, and he'd sleep curled beside me, his small hands clutching my arm for warmth. I would lie awake watching him, thinking about the future I wanted for him. A future where he would never know what it feels like to go to bed hungry, never know what it feels like to be left out, never know the pain of being small in a world that only respects the big. When he grew older, his needs grew too, but my love didn't change. I sold my jewelry, what little I had left from my wedding, to pay for his school fees. Every piece of gold that left my hand felt like a piece of my own life, but I gave it willingly. I told myself it would shine again on him. He studied hard, and I was proud. He became my success story, my proof that sacrifice could create something beautiful. When he got his first job, I remember crying quietly in the kitchen while cooking dinner. It wasn't sadness, it was relief. Relief that maybe now I could rest. Maybe now, for once, he would tell me to sit down, to eat first, to stop worrying. I had built my whole world around that hope. But life is strange. It changes quietly, without warning. The same child who once saved half his sweet for me began to save his time for others. The same boy who once asked if I'd eaten started forgetting to ask at all. It didn't happen suddenly. It happened like the slow fading of a light bulb. You don't notice the darkness at first. It creeps in softly until one day you realize you're sitting in the dark alone. After he married, the house began to change. The walls stayed the same, but the warmth disappeared. The kitchen, once full of chatter and laughter, became a place of silence. His wife didn't like my ways. She said I was too slow, too old-fashioned, too sentimental. I never argued. I thought love could survive disrespect if you just stayed quiet enough. I began cooking less. They ordered food often, from fancy restaurants, food I couldn't even pronounce. They would eat together, laughing at things I didn't understand, leaving me out of the conversation. I would sit in the corner, eating quietly after they finished, telling myself it was fine, that at least they were happy. But deep down, I missed the small things. The way he used to ask for a second serving, the way he'd say, "Thank you," after every meal, the way he'd hum while eating. Those sounds were my music once. Now all I heard was silence and cutlery. The day he told me not to touch his things because I don't understand modern life, I realized he had outgrown not just poverty, but me. Still, I loved him. Mothers don't stop loving because their children change. Love, to a mother, is like breathing, automatic, endless, even when it hurts. I would wake early, make tea for him, and leave it on the table before he woke up. He never said thank you, but I kept doing it. I kept hoping he'd notice, that one morning he'd walk into the kitchen, smile, and say, "You eat first, Mom." But that morning never came. Instead, I became part of the furniture, seen, but not felt. I learned to make myself small, to walk quietly, to breathe softly. I started collecting small moments of kindness like rare treasures. A nod, a brief smile, an accidental thank you. Those became my gifts. And yet, even through the pain, I never stopped cooking for him. Because that's what mothers do. We feed, even when we're empty. We give, even when nothing is given back. Sometimes when he went to work, I would open the kitchen window and look out at the world. I'd see other mothers with their grown children, laughing, walking arm in arm. I'd feel something twist inside me. Not jealousy, just ache. An ache for the version of my son that still existed somewhere in my memory. The little boy who once refused to eat until I took a bite. When his first child was born, I thought things might change. I thought becoming a father would make him remember what it means to care. I held that baby in my arms, and for a moment, I saw the boy I once knew. His eyes softened, his smile returned. But it didn't last. Within months, he became busier, colder, distant again. I became just grandma, a title spoken out of habit, not love. The years passed and my body grew weaker, my steps slower. But I still cooked when I could. It was my only way of feeling useful. Food was the last language I could speak when words no longer worked. Every meal I made was a quiet offering, a reminder of who I was and how much I had loved. That's why that night, when he pushed my plate away, It wasn't just a gesture. It was the closing of a door I had kept open all my life. The final insult in a story of silent sacrifices. I sat in my room afterward, replaying everything I had ever done for him. The sleepless nights, the hunger, the tears, the prayers whispered into darkness. I had built his world from my empty stomach, and now he had taken away my right to even sit at the same table. But I didn't cry for long, because as I sat there, something stronger than sadness began to rise inside me. Something sharp, quiet, powerful. It was the memory of every meal I had skipped for him. The memory of every time I had said, "You eat first." And I realized that maybe it was time he learned what it feels like to be hungry. Not for food, but for respect. That realization was the seed of my strength. That night, I wasn't just broken, I was reborn. The change didn't happen overnight. It came like rust. Slow, quiet, eating away at what used to shine. After my son got promoted, something shifted in the air of the house. He started coming home later, talking less, smiling less. His words became shorter, his tone heavier. The boy who once hugged me for no reason now walked past me without even noticing I was there. At first, I told myself it was work. Everyone changes when life gets busy. Maybe he was tired. Maybe I was expecting too much. But then, I started hearing a new voice. Not his, but his wife's. It crept into our home like perfume that lingers even when the person leaves. Sweet on the outside, sharp underneath. She started rearranging things in the house. The photos on the wall, the cushions on the sofa, even the kitchen shelves. My hands, which had set everything in order for decades, suddenly felt unwelcome in my own space. She said she was modernizing, but what she was really doing was erasing my presence. At first, I stayed quiet. I told myself, let her have her way. Peace is better than pride. But peace built on silence is just another kind of prison. The house began to sound different. The laughter that once filled it became whispers behind closed doors. When I entered a room, conversation stopped. When I spoke, eyes rolled. Slowly, I became a guest in the very place I had built. Meals became shorter too. They started eating earlier, sometimes without calling me. I'd hear the clinking of plates, the sound of the refrigerator door, their laughter. Faint, but enough to cut through my chest. By the time I entered the kitchen, there'd be leftovers, cold and dry. I'd heat them quietly, pretending I preferred it that way. I noticed the small things first. His eyes avoiding mine, the way his wife called me her instead of mom. Then came the bigger things. The sighs when I asked for help, the mockery hidden behind jokes, the tone that said I was an inconvenience. One day, she told him she didn't want me cooking anymore. She said my food was too oily, too old-fashioned. He nodded, not even looking at me. That nod hurt more than her words. It was the nod of agreement that said, "She's right. You're outdated." The kitchen that had once been my temple became her territory. My utensils moved, my spices replaced, my recipes forgotten. I stood at the doorway sometimes, just watching, feeling like a stranger in a place that had once smelled like love. I noticed something else. My son had begun to laugh differently. It wasn't the warm laugh I knew. It was shorter, colder, like he was performing for someone else. When I spoke, he didn't really listen. His eyes always drifted away, searching for escape. He started spending weekends away, saying he had work meetings. The house was quieter then, But the silence didn't bring peace anymore. It brought reflection. And reflection brought pain. The few times we did sit together for dinner, he talked only to his wife. If I tried to join, he changed the topic. She'd glance at me like I was a background noise she had to tolerate. I would smile politely, cut my food quietly, and count down the minutes until I could leave the table. Once, I left a small note on his desk, a reminder of an old memory, something sweet. He never mentioned it. I found it in the trash the next morning, folded neatly but thrown away. That was when I realized that memories mean nothing to those who have outgrown their roots. He bought new furniture, replaced the curtains, changed the house I loved into something sleek and cold. He said it looked modern. To me, it just looked empty. No warmth, no soul, just things replacing feelings. I stopped trying to talk after that. Every word I spoke felt like a burden. When I asked simple things, he sighed before answering, like I was wasting his time. When I smiled, he didn't smile back. Love doesn't die loudly. It fades in sighs, in silence, in averted eyes. The hardest part wasn't his anger. It was his indifference. Indifference is colder than hate. At least hate feels something. Indifference feels nothing. He started leaving his shoes on the table, his phone on my prayer mat, his laughter in rooms where my tears had once fallen. He no longer noticed the difference between respect and convenience. One evening, his wife told her friends on the phone that living with me felt like babysitting an old relic. I was in the next room. She knew I could hear. She wanted me to. I sat still, not saying a word. That night, I prayed not for kindness, but for strength. I told myself that love should forgive, but even forgiveness needs space to breathe. I had no space left in that house. I was surrounded by the walls I had painted, but they no longer belonged to me. Every day became a test of patience. Every look became a reminder that I was slowly being pushed out. Not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Still, I cooked for them. Still, I cleaned. Still, I smiled. Because that's what mothers do. We hope that someday the child will remember. But the child who once called me Ma had become a man who now called me her. Then came the dinner. The night when patience finally ended. The night when silence became my weapon. When he pushed my plate away and said, "Doh, old people eat last," it wasn't just an insult. It was the full stop at the end of a long sentence written in neglect. But that night didn't break me. It defined me. It was the moment I stopped being afraid of losing him because I realized I had already lost him long ago. The dinner that changed everything started like any other, quiet, ordinary, and full of unspoken tension. The table was neatly set, the food still steaming, the smell of spices floating through the air. I had made his favorite dish again, though he hadn't asked for it in years. I suppose mothers never stop hoping that food can fix what words cannot. The candles on the table flickered softly, their light dancing on faces that no longer smiled at me. I sat at the edge, not really part of the scene, but still present, as if habit refused to let me disappear completely. There were guests that evening, 2 of his friends and their wives. I had known them when they were all young boys running through the street, chasing kites, eating from my kitchen, calling me Auntie. Now they were men in expensive clothes, carrying laughter that didn't sound real. I greeted them politely, and they smiled out of manners, not warmth. My son, proud of his house, his success, his life, introduced them to his wife as if I were just another decoration in the background. I watched him from across the table, confident, loud, proud. He talked about his work, his travels, his new car. Every word was filled with self-importance. The boy who once thanked me for buying him school shoes was now a man who forgot who had walked barefoot so he could wear them. His wife laughed loudly at every word he said, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes shining with a kind of ownership. Dinner began, and I waited for my turn, like always. They filled their plates, passed dishes around, talking over each other. I sat quietly, watching, waiting. The laughter grew louder, the room smaller. Then, as I reached for my plate, he did it again, only this time in front of everyone. He pushed my plate away with the back of his hand, barely looking at me. "Old people eat last," he said, laughing lightly, as if it was a harmless joke. The others paused for a moment, then laughed too. Not because it was funny, but because it was easier than feeling awkward. The sound of their laughter hit me harder than his hand ever could. It wasn't just his cruelty, it was their acceptance of it. I froze, my fingers still in midair, my chest heavy. I felt the blood drain from my face, my body cold. The room suddenly felt too bright, the air too thick. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. I looked at my son, at the man who had once promised me the world. He didn't meet my eyes. He was too busy basking in the attention of others, pretending that his words were harmless. His wife laughed too, covering her mouth with her hand, as if she couldn't contain her amusement. I saw pride in her eyes, pride that her husband could humiliate his mother without flinching. No one spoke for me. No one said it was wrong. They just ate, like nothing had happened. I looked down at the plate that had been pushed away. The food still smelled good, but the scent made me sick now. My stomach twisted, my throat ached. I sat there, still, while the noise around me carried on. The forks clinked, the glasses clattered, the laughter rose again. But inside me, something had gone completely silent. I didn't cry. I didn't even sigh. I simply lowered my eyes and folded my hands on my lap. I waited for them to finish. I watched them eat the food I had cooked with trembling hands. Every bite they took felt like they were chewing through my memories, my sacrifices, my love. The humiliation was complete, and yet it wasn't loud. It was quiet, casual, cruel. That's how most betrayals are. Not shouted, just done. When the guests left, they thanked me for the lovely meal. Their words were polite, but their eyes were uncomfortable. They knew what they had seen. They just didn't have the courage to say it. My son hugged them goodbye at the door, laughing again, as if the night had been perfect. His wife walked beside him, looking satisfied. I stood in the kitchen doorway, invisible, forgotten. After they left, I cleared the table slowly. The plates were still warm, the smell of roasted food heavy in the air. My son walked past me, saying nothing. He went to his room. His wife followed, closing the door behind her. The sound of the latch clicking was final. I stood alone in that kitchen, surrounded by dishes, crumbs, and silence. I picked up my plate last, the one he had pushed away. I looked at it for a long time. It was still spotless, untouched. I thought about how many years I had spent filling plates for him, making sure he never went hungry. And now mine was empty by his choice. I washed the dishes one by one. The sound of water running filled the air, soft but steady. I didn't rush. I cleaned every plate, every spoon, every glass. I dried them carefully, placing each one back in its place, as if cleaning away the evidence of his cruelty. When I was done, I turned off the light and went to my room. But I didn't lie down. I sat by the window, staring out into the night. The sky was clear, the moon full. I thought of my husband, long gone, and wondered what he would have said if he'd seen this. I imagined his gentle voice, his tired eyes. I knew what he would have told me, that dignity is the one thing you never let anyone take. So I sat there, letting the thought settle. I had stayed quiet for too long. My silence had become his permission. Every time I forgave, every time I smiled through pain, I had taught him that cruelty had no cost. But that night, I decided that lesson would end. I didn't plan to scream or fight. That was not my way. My revenge wouldn't come from anger. It would come from truth and from loss. The kind of loss that makes a person finally see what they've broken. I looked around the room, the same walls I had painted years ago, the same bed I had bought secondhand when he was a child. Every corner of that house was built from my struggle, my sweat. And now that house didn't belong to love anymore. It belonged to pride, to arrogance, to people who had forgotten gratitude. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The humiliation still burned inside me, but beneath it was something stronger, clarity. I wasn't weak because I was old. I wasn't powerless because I was quiet. I had built everything they now took for granted, and I could unbuild it piece by piece without raising my voice. That night, I made a decision. It wasn't planned, but it felt right. Tomorrow, the table would be different. Tomorrow, I would no longer serve them. Tomorrow, they would learn that even silence can bite back. When I finally lay down, I felt no fear, just calm. The kind of calm that comes when you've decided to stop explaining yourself to people who never listened. I looked at the ceiling, at the faint reflection of moonlight, and whispered softly in my heart, "Enough." That was the last meal I ever cooked for them. That night, the house was heavy with silence, the kind that feels alive, like it's watching you. I sat on the edge of my bed, still dressed from dinner, staring at the plate I had carried back to my room. It sat untouched on the table beside me, the rice gone cold, the curry thick and congealed. I had no hunger left, only a quiet, burning thought that would not leave my mind. For hours I replayed his words again and again. Old people eat last. They echoed against the walls, inside my chest, under my skin. The same mouth that once called me Mama with sweetness had spoken those words like a verdict. It wasn't about food. It was about place. He wanted to remind me that I no longer had one in the world I built. And I knew in that moment that silence was no longer kindness. It was permission. I stood up and turned on the small lamp beside my bed. The yellow light filled the room, soft but sharp enough to show me everything clearly. The old calendar, the cupboard, the rusted tin box in the corner where I kept every document that mattered. That box had been my secret strength for years. It held the proof of every battle I had fought and survived. The house papers, the savings, the insurance, and the small notebook where I wrote down every penny I ever earned. I opened it, slowly. The smell of old paper and ink filled the room, thick with memory. My hands trembled a little, but it wasn't fear. It was focus. Inside that box lay the story of my life. Everything that existed because I refused to give up. Every number in that notebook was a scar. Every signature a survival. I looked at those papers and realized something powerful. Everything he owned, everything he stood on, had been built on my hands. He thought I had grown weak, forgotten, disposable. But what he didn't know was that mothers never forget the roots they planted. I had stayed silent out of love. Now I would act out of principle. I took out the property papers first. The name on them was mine, not his. He had always assumed the house was his inheritance, never knowing that I had kept it untouched in my own name, waiting to see who he truly became. The bank account was joint, but the deposits, every single one, had been mine. I had never used his money. Every rupee in that account came from my sacrifices. I smiled faintly as I realized the power in that truth. I sat at the table and began to write. The pen moved slowly at first, but once it began, it did not stop. I wrote a letter to my lawyer, the same man who had handled my husband's affairs decades ago. He was old now, but steady, dependable. He had seen me rise from a widow with nothing to a woman who owned her peace. I wrote that I needed to meet him in the morning. I didn't explain why. Some things are better spoken face to face, without emotion in ink. Next, I wrote another letter, a shorter one. This one was for my son. I kept my words simple. No anger, no accusations, just truth. I wrote about how love cannot survive in a house where respect is starved. How every meal I cooked had been an act of devotion, not duty. How the hands that feed deserve to be treated with grace, not mockery. I ended with one sentence that felt heavier than anything I had ever said to him. If you believe old people eat last, then you must learn how it feels to eat alone. I folded the letter neatly, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it on the table. The lamplight flickered for a moment, as if nodding in agreement. I sat back and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. That breath carried away fear, pain, and a lifetime of silent endurance. It was strange. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt calm, almost peaceful, because revenge wasn't what I wanted. I only wanted to restore balance, to remind him of the truth that love without gratitude is a wound that never heals. When dawn came, I didn't sleep. I changed into a clean sari, combed my hair neatly, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't weak or broken. She was older, yes, but sharper. Carved by time, strengthened by disappointment. I smiled faintly. This was not the face of defeat. It was the face of reckoning. I walked quietly to the living room. The house was still, the air cold. I could hear my son snoring faintly from his room, unaware that his life was about to change. I went to the kitchen, made myself a cup of tea, and stood by the window watching the first light of morning. The sun was rising slow and golden, washing the walls in warmth. It felt like a sign, like something inside the universe had finally tilted in my favor. When the clock struck 7, I dialed the number from memory. My lawyer's assistant picked up, and within minutes, the meeting was set. He would be expecting me by 9. I packed my papers carefully in an envelope and placed them in my bag. Before leaving, I paused in the hallway and looked at the family photos hanging on the wall. His wedding photo was there, smiling faces frozen in time. I touched the glass gently. "You were my pride once," I whispered in my heart. "Now you are my lesson." The walk to the lawyer's office was long, but I didn't feel tired. Every step felt lighter than the last. I passed people carrying groceries, children in school uniforms, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. Life was moving forward, and so was I. When I reached his office, he greeted me with a kind smile. We talked for an hour. I told him everything, not just about the insult, but about the years of slow erosion that led to it. He listened without interruption, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. When I finished, he nodded and said only one thing. "You've carried enough. Let the papers speak now." Together, we drafted new documents. The property would no longer go to my son. The joint account would be closed, and my savings would be transferred into a trust, one that supported elderly women who had no one left to care for them. I had been one insult away from becoming one of them. Now I would make sure others had safety before Silence. When the papers were ready, I signed them slowly, firmly, without hesitation. The pen felt heavy in my hand, but it was the weight of freedom. The lawyer asked if I was sure. I smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything," I said. As I walked home, the sun had climbed high, the day clear and bright. The world looked ordinary, but I felt something extraordinary: power, peace, and an ache that had finally found purpose. That night I packed my things quietly. Just a few clothes, my medicines, and the envelope with my son's letter. I didn't take much. I didn't need to. Dignity doesn't require possessions. I placed the letter on the kitchen table where he would see it in the morning. Next to it, I left his breakfast plate, empty. I wanted him to feel the same emptiness I had felt at dinner. I wanted him to look at that bare plate and remember the hands that had filled it for years. Before I left the house, I looked back once. The walls, the furniture, the memories. They would stay, but I no longer belonged to them. I stepped outside into the morning air, the sun warm on my face for the first time. Long time, I felt free. If he wanted me to eat last, he could live with the hunger of his own making. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't pray for change. I simply closed my eyes, knowing the lesson had begun, and that by morning, he would wake up to a silence he had created with his own hands. The morning came soft and bright, but the house was not the same. The silence felt heavier than the night before. I woke up early, before the sun had fully risen, my eyes opening to a strange calmness. The air was still, the sky pale gold, and the light that entered through the curtain made the dust in the air shimmer like floating memories. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to hurry to the kitchen. I didn't feel the need to prepare breakfast for anyone else. That morning was mine. I sat up slowly, my back stiff but my mind clear. My suitcase was already packed, sitting neatly by the corner of the bed. The papers were sealed and safe in my bag, the letter for my son still lying on the kitchen table. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No clatter of spoons, no sound of voices, just the faint ticking of the wall clock. I realized how much noise I had once made just trying to keep this place alive. My footsteps, my cooking, my humming, they had all been the heartbeat of this house. And now, I had stopped. I walked to the mirror and looked at myself. My hair was streaked with silver, my eyes lined with age. But there was something new there: strength. I had seen this face every day, but that morning it looked different. It looked free. I smiled faintly and whispered to my reflection, "Let's begin." I went to the kitchen. The same table where I had been humiliated the night before was waiting in silence. I could almost see the moment replaying in my mind, the laughter, the push, the sting of words that still lingered in the air. But now that table was mine again. It was the stage for something new. I lit the stove and boiled water for tea. Just one cup, just for me. I took my time, letting the sound of the bubbling water fill the room. It was a sound of comfort, of old habits. But this time, it belonged to me alone. I poured the tea into my favorite cup, the one with a chipped edge, and sat down at the table. My son was still asleep in his room. His wife, too. Their door was closed. The same door they had shut after laughing at me. I sipped my tea slowly. Every sip tasted like freedom. When the clock struck 7, I stood up, placed an empty plate in front of the chair he usually sat on, and beside it, I placed the letter I had written the night before. I adjusted the edge of the envelope until it sat perfectly straight. The table looked calm, too calm. I wanted the silence to speak for me. I didn't leave food for him, not a crumb. The plate stayed empty, the spoon dry, the cup spotless. I wanted him to look at it and see the reflection of his own words. Old people eat last. That was the meal he had served me, and now he would taste it himself. I checked my bag one last time. Documents, clothes, medicine, everything in place. I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the photographs one last time. The laughter frozen in those pictures felt far away now. Each frame told a story that had ended long ago. As I passed the living room, I paused by his wedding photo. I remembered how proud I had been that day, how I had smiled through tears, believing he was stepping into happiness. I had prayed for his success, his peace, his family. I never prayed for revenge. But life, it seems, delivers justice through the simplest acts. The sun had risen higher now, light spilling through the windows, turning everything gold. I walked to the front door, the sound of my slippers soft against the floor. The key turned in the lock with a sound that felt final. Before I stepped out, I looked back one last time. The kitchen glowed in sunlight. The empty plate shone on the table. The envelope waited like a quiet storm. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The air was cool and clean. Birds sang somewhere far away. I walked slowly down the path, my bag light on my shoulder, my heart even lighter. I didn't look back again. I didn't need to. My silence would do the talking now. Inside the house, time moved forward as if nothing had changed. The fan spun lazily. The clock ticked. And then, finally, I heard it. The faint creak of a door opening. He woke up late that morning, yawning, stretching, unaware. He called out for breakfast, his voice echoing through the house. There was no answer. He called again, louder this time, irritation creeping into his tone. Still, silence. He walked into the kitchen, expecting the smell of food, the sight of me standing by the stove. But all he found was emptiness. The stove was cold. The kettle was empty. The table was bare except for one plate and one letter. His brows furrowed. He looked around, confused. Then he saw the plate, clean, untouched, shining under the morning sun. For a moment, he didn't understand. He called for me again. Nothing. He reached for the letter, hesitating, his fingers trembling slightly, though he didn't know why. The envelope felt heavy for its size. He tore it open and began to read. The words were simple, short, but they landed like stones. You told me old people eat last. Today, you will know what it feels like to eat alone. I am not angry. I am not hurt. I am done. The house is yours for now, but the papers are not. The lawyer will call. Until then, take care. And remember this plate when you sit at every table for the rest of your life." He dropped the letter. It fluttered to the floor. The silence around him grew unbearable. He sat down slowly, staring at the empty plate, the cup beside it. The sound of the clock ticking felt louder than ever. He realized then what he had never seen before, how much life I had poured into that house. Every morning, he woke to the smell of food. Every time he found clean clothes, every quiet comfort. All of it had come from me, and now they were gone. He waited for me to return, pacing the floor, checking the window, calling my phone. I didn't answer. Each ring echoed like guilt bouncing off the walls. He called again and again, but silence was my reply. He went to the stove, opened the pots, searched the cupboards. Empty. Nothing left but his reflection on the steel surfaces, sharp, pale, unfamiliar. He sat down again, the letter still in his hand, and for the first time, he understood what hunger really meant. It wasn't just about food, it was about absence. The absence of care, the absence of respect, the absence of love he had taken for granted until it disappeared. When the doorbell rang an hour later, he rushed to open it, hoping maybe I had come back. But it was not me. It was the lawyer. The lawyer's face was calm, professional, but his words were clear. "Your mother asked me to inform you," he said, "that the ownership of this house and the accounts associated with it have been transferred. You'll receive the formal notice by noon." My son stood frozen. His wife appeared behind him, confused, asking questions he couldn't answer. The lawyer handed him a document, offered a brief nod, and left. The sound of the door closing felt heavier than thunder. He opened the document with shaking hands. Each line confirmed what he feared. Everything had changed. The house, the land, the savings, all reassigned, sealed, legal. His name was nowhere. He sank into a chair, his face pale, his breath shallow. He looked at the table again. The empty plate was still there, untouched, just as I had left it. He had food in the fridge, money in his wallet, but something far greater was missing. The warmth that once made this house a home had vanished, replaced by his own echo. That morning, he ate alone. And as he lifted his fork to his mouth, the taste of the food turned bitter. Because hunger isn't always about the stomach. Sometimes it's the soul that starves. He finished the meal quietly, his pride shrinking with every bite. For the first time in his life, he understood what silence can do, how it can teach what words never could. That morning, justice wasn't loud. It was quiet. It came in the form of an empty plate, a short letter, and a silence that filled every corner of the house like truth finally finding its voice. And that morning, as he sat alone at the same table where he once pushed my plate away, he realized old people don't eat last. They just stop serving those who forget who fed them first. The sun had fully risen by the time the knock came on his door. It was sharp, firm, official, the kind of knock that makes silence nervous. My son opened it half awake, still clutching the letter I had left, the words "eat alone" echoing inside him like a curse he couldn't shake. The man standing outside wore a plain gray suit and carried a file under his arm. His tone was polite but distant as he asked, "Are you Mr. My son nodded, uncertain. The man handed him an envelope stamped with the red seal of law. He tore it open, expecting confusion, maybe some mistake. But as he unfolded the papers, his eyes widened. Each line was clear, cold, and final. Every property under my name, The house, the land, the small savings account, even the pension fund had been legally transferred. His name was not on a single document. The house he called his had never truly belonged to him. And now it never would. For a moment, the color drained from his face. His hands trembled, but he tried to hide it. His wife came from the bedroom, still in her robe, asking what was going on. He said nothing. He just handed her the paper. She scanned the first few lines, then looked at him in disbelief. "This can't be real," she whispered. But it was. It was real, sealed, notarized, and already registered. The law doesn't care for emotions. He stumbled back and sat at the edge of the sofa. The house around him suddenly felt different. Heavier, smaller, as though it knew it didn't belong to him anymore. He stared at the walls, the photographs, the furniture, and realized that everything he touched had been given, not earned. The officer spoke again, calm and professional. "Mrs. has requested that you vacate the property within 30 days. You will receive a follow-up notice regarding the remaining accounts. Please sign here to acknowledge receipt." His voice had no emotion, but his words landed like stones. My son hesitated, his pride fighting his reality. But eventually, he signed. His signature shook across the page. When the officer left, silence filled the house again. His wife began pacing, muttering about humiliation, about neighbors, about losing everything she thought was hers. But he didn't respond. He couldn't. He was staring at the same empty plate I had left on the table. The letter beside it now wrinkled and open. He finally understood that the hunger he felt wasn't for food, it was for control, for love, for something he had broken with his own hands. He walked through the house slowly, touching the walls the way one touches something dying. Every room echoed with my presence. The smell of my cooking still faint in the air. The small embroidery on the curtains I had stitched years ago. The chair I used to sit on by the window. It was all still there, yet everything had changed. He wasn't the master here anymore. He was a guest in a house owned by his mother's memory. He went to the kitchen, where the sunlight fell across the table like a blade. The plate still shone in its emptiness. He stared at it for a long time. He could almost see me sitting across from him, quiet, composed, my eyes full of the calm that always unsettled him. He could hear his own voice echoing, "Old people eat last." Those words now tasted like ash. He sat down, elbows on the table, his head in his hands. The morning had started like any other, but it had turned into a lesson carved in reality. The laughter from the previous night, the mockery, the arrogance, all of it now hung in the air like ghosts. By noon, the lawyer arrived. He was the same man who had guided me through my life's hardest chapters. His presence filled the room with authority. My son stood when he entered, confused, hopeful maybe that this was all a misunderstanding. But hope fades fast when truth arrives on paper. The lawyer opened his briefcase and placed the documents neatly on the table. "Your mother came to see me yesterday," he began. "She made changes to her estate. Everything you're about to hear was her decision. Clear, conscious, and legal." My son swallowed hard. His wife stood behind him, arms crossed, eyes sharp with fear and anger. The lawyer continued, his tone firm but not cruel. "As of this morning, your mother's assets have been reassigned. The ownership of this property and her accounts now belong to a charitable foundation, one dedicated to supporting elderly women who have been neglected or mistreated by their families. Your mother specifically requested that it be named the second table. The words hit him harder than any slap could. The second table. The name was deliberate, the meaning clear. It was the table where I had been told to wait, the table where I had eaten after everyone else. Now, that name would live longer than his pride. The lawyer handed him another document, my signed letter of instruction. She asked me to give you this as well, he said. My son unfolded it with shaking hands. The paper smelled faintly of my perfume, the ink still fresh. My handwriting was small, careful, full of patience even now. It read, "You taught me that old people eat last. I taught you that they can also take the table with them. This house was built by my hunger, my sacrifice, and my love. It will now feed those who know the value of respect. May this be your reminder that no plate stays full forever." The lawyer folded his hands and waited. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. My son's wife turned away, hiding her face. My son sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the letter, his breath uneven. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the lawyer stood, gathering his papers. "Your mother did not wish for punishment," he said gently. "She only wanted peace. I suggest you honor that by finding yours." He left quietly. The door clicked shut, and with that sound, everything else collapsed. The pride, the arrogance, the illusion of control. My son sat there for hours, not moving, not speaking. The sunlight shifted across the floor, fading slowly into the pale gray of evening. He stayed at the table, his hands still resting on the letter. His wife packed her things quietly in the background, muttering about mistakes, about leaving before gossip arrived. He didn't stop her. He didn't even look up. When night fell, the house was empty again. Just him and the echo of my absence. He walked through it like a stranger, past the rooms that once held warmth, past the cupboard where I kept the tin box, past the chair where I used to sit and wait for him to come home. He stopped at the kitchen door, staring into the dark. The empty plate still lay there, shining faintly in the moonlight. He sat down, his shoulders heavy, and finally allowed himself to feel it. Not hunger, not anger, but regret. He whispered my name once, softly, but the silence swallowed it whole. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, gentle and slow, like a lullaby for endings. The same wind that carried my strength now filled the rooms of the house he no longer owned. That night, he learned what it means to lose not just property, but the presence that made it home. He learned that wealth without love is poverty dressed in gold. The next morning, when the first light touched his face, he didn't wake to the smell of food or the warmth of tea. He woke to the sound of his own breath and the coldness of a house that didn't want him anymore. And somewhere far away, in a small rented room where I now lived, I sat by a window, drinking tea from a chipped cup. The morning sun touched my face, and I smiled. Not with triumph, but with peace. The kind that comes when you know the lesson has been delivered and the truth has finally found its way home. Because sometimes, justice doesn't arrive in anger or violence. It arrives quietly, on paper, signed, sealed, and irreversible. And that was the morning my son truly understood the meaning of old people eat last. The days that followed the legal shock were long and heavy, like time had decided to slow down just to make him feel every second of it. The house that once smelled of fresh food and laughter now smelled like old dust and stale air. The curtains stayed closed, sunlight slipping only through small cracks, drawing faint golden lines across the furniture. He didn't open them. He couldn't. Every corner of that house carried my touch, and now that I was gone, he couldn't stand to see what he had taken for granted for so long. He stopped leaving the house. The man who once walked with his head held high through the market now hid inside his own walls. Neighbors whispered when they passed by the gate. Some pitied him. Others didn't. Everyone knew what had happened. The story of the son who had mocked his mother and lost everything spread quietly, carried by voices that never stopped moving. He could feel the stares even when he wasn't outside. Shame has a way of finding you, even behind locked doors. At first, he tried to tell himself it wasn't real. He believed I would call, that I would forgive him, that maybe the papers could be undone, that I would come back and fix everything like I always had. But I didn't. The silence stretched day after day, growing heavier, colder. The phone never rang. The door never opened. The woman he once thought would always be there for him was gone, and the only sound that kept him company was the tick of the clock on the wall. Slow, steady, and merciless. He started avoiding the kitchen. It had become a place of ghosts. Every time he walked past it, he remembered my hands stirring soup, the sound of the kettle boiling, the smell of rice on the stove. He could almost hear my voice calling him for dinner. But when he turned his head, there was nothing. Just the empty plate still sitting where he had left it, shining faintly under the dull light. One morning, he tried to cook for himself. He burned the bread, spilled the tea, dropped the cup. The small crash echoed louder than it should have, and he stood there staring at the mess, his chest tight. He realized something that day. Feeding someone is not just an act of care. It is love in motion. It is the quiet way mothers say, "You exist because I choose to keep you full." And now he felt what it was like when that love stopped moving. His wife changed too. She stopped pretending to care. She didn't hide her anger or her fear anymore. The arguments started small. Whispers behind closed doors, sharp looks across the room. Then they grew louder. She blamed me for their downfall. She said the humiliation had ruined their name, that people would never look at them the same way again. But deep down, she knew it wasn't my fault. She just couldn't stand the mirror that truth had placed in front of her husband. One night, after another fight, she packed her clothes in silence. The sound of the suitcase zipper cut through the room. He stood by the doorway, saying nothing. She didn't even look at him when she walked out. The door closed behind her with a soft thud, but it sounded final. He waited for her to come back. She didn't. He was truly alone now. The first week after she left, he barely ate. Food didn't taste the same. The silence at the table was unbearable. He would sit where I used to sit, staring at the chair across from him, the one he had pushed my plate away from. Every night he stared at that spot, as if expecting me to appear again, holding something warm, saying something gentle. But the only thing that answered him was his own reflection in the glass cabinet, tired eyes, hollow face, and the kind of loneliness that feels like punishment. He started cleaning the house. At first, it was to distract himself, but then it became something else. He wiped every surface, arranged every corner, as if by doing so he could erase what he had done. He found my shawl in the drawer, folded neatly, still smelling faintly of soap. He sat down with it pressed to his face, and for the first time since I left, he broke down. The sound of his crying filled the room, a sound the house had never heard before. He found my old prayer book next, pages bent, edges soft from years of use. My handwriting filled the margins. Little notes, reminders, and verses about patience and forgiveness. He sat there for hours reading each one, his tears falling onto the ink, blurring the words. And somewhere between those lines, he realized forgiveness isn't something you receive after hurting someone. It's something you earn by living with what you did. The nights were the worst. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing echoes that weren't there. The laughter from that dinner still haunted him. The way his voice had sounded. Proud, sharp, cruel. Now felt like it belonged to a stranger. Sometimes he whispered my name just to hear it in the air again, but the silence after was worse than no sound at all. It reminded him that love, once lost, doesn't return to the same house twice. Weeks passed. The neighbors stopped checking in. Bills came. The lawyer's follow-up letters arrived with legal notices and updates about the foundation I had created. The name printed on them, the second table, was a wound that reopened every time he saw it. He couldn't escape it. The world outside moved on, but inside that house, time had stopped the morning I walked away. One afternoon, he walked to the mirror in the living room and looked at himself properly for the first time in months. His hair had grayed, his skin looked older. There were lines under his eyes that hadn't been there before. He didn't look like the man he used to be. He looked like his own father, weary, regretful, broken. And then finally, he said it out loud. I did this. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't even loud. It was just truth, simple and bare. And the truth, once spoken, doesn't leave easily. It stays. He tried to fix things in small ways. He started cooking again. Sometimes he made tea and placed 2 cups on the table, one for me, untouched. Sometimes he talked to the empty chair, telling it about his day, about how sorry he was. But guilt is not cured by routine. It stays until you learn to forgive yourself, and that was something he didn't know how to do. One morning, he went to the temple. It was the first time he had stepped outside in months. People stared, but no one spoke. He lit a candle, knelt down, and whispered prayers under his breath. The priest recognized him and nodded politely, but didn't say much. He had heard the story too. Everyone had. My son stayed there for a long time. Hands pressed together, eyes closed, until his tears fell freely. When he opened his eyes, the world looked different. Smaller, quieter, and lonelier. When he came home that day, he walked into my room. He hadn't entered it since I left. Everything was still as I had left it. The neatly folded blanket, the framed photo of him as a child, the small tin box on the shelf. He sat on the bed, picked up the photo, and traced the outline of his face in it. Then he whispered, "I don't deserve you." His voice broke. He opened the tin box, finding the few small keepsakes I hadn't taken with me, a silver chain, an old savings book, a small note with his name written in my handwriting. He held it close to his chest and closed his eyes. For a long time, he didn't move. From that day on, something in him changed. He no longer avoided the kitchen. He cooked simple meals, rice, soup, tea, and ate quietly, without distractions. He began leaving a portion of food on the side, untouched, every time. Maybe it was a habit, maybe a ritual, maybe penance. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't have anyone left to tell. The house grew quieter, but the silence became different. Less heavy, more accepting. He had stopped fighting it. He had learned to live with what he had done, even if the weight never fully left. Every morning, he sat by the window with his tea and looked out at the street, watching people pass. Sometimes he smiled faintly when he saw mothers walking with their children. Maybe he saw a piece of what he had lost in them. Months passed. The seasons changed. The world outside the gate forgot the scandal. But inside, nothing was forgotten. My absence stayed like a shadow that never moved. The walls still whispered when the wind blew through them. The clock still ticked in the same rhythm it always had. He had learned that love, when disrespected, doesn't die. It leaves, taking everything it ever touched with it. And in its place, it leaves something heavier than hunger: silence. By the end of that year, he no longer looked like the man who once mocked his mother. He looked like a man who had seen what pride costs when it's paid in love. And every morning, when he sat down for breakfast, he made sure to place 2 plates on the table, one for himself and one for the memory that would never return. Because he now understood what I had meant when I said nothing at all. He understood that silence was never weakness. It was the final word. Time has a strange way of softening everything. It doesn't erase what happened, but it turns the sharp edges into something that no longer cuts. Months passed quietly after I left that house. I didn't move far, just far enough that my mornings no longer carried the weight of memory. The room I rented was small, but it had sunlight. The walls were plain, but they held peace. I didn't need much: a kettle, a small stove, a few books, and the calm that comes from finally being free of disappointment. For the first time in years, I woke up without fear of hearing cruelty in my own home. I began living simply. Every morning I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window to watch life move outside. Children walked to school. Women sold vegetables by the road. Old men gathered at the tea stall, talking about everything and nothing. The world hadn't changed much, but I had. I no longer waited for anyone. Waiting is a habit that love teaches and disappointment cures. I started helping at a nearby community kitchen for children. They called me auntie, not mother, but their smiles made my heart full again. Every meal I served them reminded me that giving doesn't have to hurt. Love can exist without being stepped on. When I watched them eat, messy, loud, happy, I thought of my son when he was that age. The same eyes, the same hunger, the same innocence that time eventually steals. Sometimes I'd pause and whisper softly, "Eat well, little ones," because I knew that food given with care carries the taste of memory. Life found its rhythm again. The evenings were quiet, but they were mine. I'd light a candle, read old letters from my husband, and talk to him in my thoughts. I told him everything: the betrayal, the insult, the lesson, and the peace that followed. In some way, I felt like he was listening. Maybe he was proud that I finally learned to protect my own dignity. Weeks turned into months. One morning, as I walked through the market, I saw my son standing at the other end of the street. He looked different. Thinner, older, smaller somehow. Our eyes met for just a second. He didn't walk toward me, and I didn't either. There was no anger, no hate, only the quiet understanding that some distances are necessary. He lowered his eyes first, then walked away. I stood there watching him disappear into the crowd. I didn't cry. The time for tears had passed long ago. The foundation I created, the second table, began growing. Letters came in from people I'd never met. Women who had been cast aside by their families wrote to me saying they finally had a place to sleep, a plate to eat from, and a reason to live again. The first time I visited the shelter, I felt something warm inside me. Not pride, but peace. I saw old women cooking together, laughing over small mistakes, sharing stories that sounded like mine. I realized then that I hadn't lost a son. I had found dozens of daughters in their faces. One of them asked me once, "Do you miss your family?" I smiled and said, "No, child. I just miss who they used to be." That's the truth. Love doesn't vanish. It just moves to quieter places. Sometimes at night, I still dream of that old kitchen. I see the table, the plates, the laughter that turned to silence. But the dream doesn't hurt anymore. It feels like watching a movie from another life. I wake up, light my lamp, and thank the universe for giving me the strength to walk away when love stopped being kind. A year later, on a winter morning, I received a letter. It was from my son. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain. The paper smelled faintly of regret. He wrote that the house felt empty without me, that he understood now what respect truly meant. He didn't ask for forgiveness, just the chance to see me once. I read it 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in my drawer. I didn't reply immediately. Some answers need to ripen in silence. A few weeks later, I wrote a short note back. I told him I was doing well, that I hoped he was too. I told him to take care of himself, to eat properly, and to never let pride sit at his table again. I didn't mention the past. I didn't need to. The past had already spoken for both of us. He came to see me one afternoon not long after. He didn't bring flowers or gifts. He just stood at the doorway, looking like a boy who had finally realized he was lost. His eyes filled with tears when he saw me, and for a moment, the years fell away. I saw not the man who had pushed my plate away, but the child who used to hold my hand. He tried to speak, but his voice broke. I nodded quietly and gestured for him to sit. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Sometimes silence becomes the most honest language between two hearts that have hurt each other too deeply. When he left that day, I didn't feel anger or victory. I just felt peace. He had finally seen what I wanted him to see. Not my power, not my revenge, but my worth. After that visit, we didn't meet often. A phone call now and then, a polite check-in during holidays. It wasn't closeness, but it was enough. Not every wound needs to close. Some just need to stop bleeding. One evening, as I sat by my window, I thought of everything that had happened. The insults, the hunger, the silence, the will, the loss, and the peace that came after. I realized I had stopped being afraid the day I chose my dignity over my dependence. That day, I didn't just regain my voice. I rebuilt my soul. Now, when I look back, I don't see tragedy. I see transformation. I see a woman who gave, who was broken, and who rebuilt herself from the same pieces others tried to scatter. I sometimes visit the temple on quiet mornings. I light incense, close my eyes, and whisper a prayer, not for revenge, but for forgiveness. Not for him, but for myself. Because holding pain too long makes you forget who you are. Letting go, however, reminds you that peace is the only true justice. These days, I sit with other women my age at the shelter, sharing stories, laughter, and tea. They call me Grandma Ruth. Some of them cry when they talk about their children. I hold their hands and tell them, love them still, but never let them take your respect. And they nod because they understand. Every story in that room begins with heartbreak. but every ending carries strength. I've learned that suffering doesn't destroy you. It introduces you to yourself. Sometimes in the quiet of the evening, I open an old box that holds a few photographs. One of them is my son's wedding picture. I don't look at the faces for long. I just look at the gold chain around the bride's neck, the same one his father had left for me. It makes me smile. Even in brokenness, some things survive. When I close the box, I feel lighter. I no longer live inside the pain of what happened. I live in the lesson it gave me. That silence, when born from dignity, is louder than any insult ever spoken. And when I see the plaque at the shelter's gate that reads "the second table," I smile again. Because what started as humiliation became hope for others. That name, born from cruelty, became the name of healing. I didn't set out to take revenge. I just wanted to be seen. I wanted the love I gave to be remembered with respect. In the end, I found something even better, peace that no one could take away again. Now, when I sit alone in the evenings, I look at the horizon and whisper softly, "Some meals you eat with company, some with memory. Both can fill you, if your heart is at peace." And to those who listen to my story, I say this: never mistake kindness for weakness, and never let anyone make you feel like you belong at the end of the table. Because love without respect is hunger, and I have learned to feed my soul instead. The years after everything settled were quiet, peaceful, and filled with small moments that finally began to heal what life had broken. The house was no longer mine, yet I never felt homeless. The world outside that gate was wide and forgiving, and for the first time in my life, I learned how to live just for myself. There was no shouting, no tension, no waiting for footsteps that came with disrespect. The mornings were slow, the evenings gentle, and my heart, for the first time in many years, was calm. I found joy in the smallest things: the smell of wet soil after rain, the laughter of children playing near the market, the comfort of a warm cup of tea between my hands. Sometimes peace doesn't arrive in grand gestures. It comes quietly, after all the noise ends, after all the hurt has said its last word. I used to believe that the world owed me an apology. Now I know that peace is the only apology worth accepting. The foundation, the second table, became my pride. Every month, I visited it. The rooms were always full, old women, forgotten by their families, sitting together, laughing softly as they cooked and shared food. I would watch them serve each other with hands that trembled, but hearts that didn't. Their kindness filled the air with something sacred. That place was built from my pain, but it had turned into something beautiful. It no longer belonged to sadness. It belonged to strength. When I saw their faces, I realized something I had missed my whole life: that family isn't always blood. Sometimes family is built out of people who understand your silence, who sit beside you, not to ask questions, but simply to stay. Those women became my family. We ate together every evening, sitting around one large table, the same way families should, without pride, without insult, without anyone eating last. My son came to visit one afternoon. It had been over a year since the will had been read. He looked different, thinner, quieter, softer. The arrogance had left his eyes, replaced by something that looked like grief and acceptance. He didn't walk with the same confidence he used to. He walked like a man who had been humbled by life, and that was enough for me to see that the lesson had worked. He stood by the doorway for a long time before stepping inside. His hands were empty. No gifts, no excuses. Just a quiet presence. I smiled faintly and asked him to sit. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. Sometimes silence between two people says more than any conversation. I could see regret written all over his face. He didn't have to speak it. His eyes spoke for him. He looked around the room, at the women cooking, at the laughter, at the smell of fresh food, and I could tell it broke him a little inside. Because he saw in them what he had lost. He saw the warmth of a home that no longer waited for him. And maybe that's why he came, not for forgiveness, but to remember what love used to feel like. Before he left, he touched my hand lightly. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of years. For the first time in a long time, I didn't pull away. I just nodded, and he understood. Forgiveness doesn't always need words. Sometimes it's just the way you choose not to turn away. After he left, I sat there for a long while, looking at the empty chair he had just vacated. There was a strange calm inside me. Not joy, not sadness, just completion. I realized that revenge isn't about making someone suffer. It's about teaching them what pain feels like, not through cruelty, but through consequence. He had learned. I had healed. That was enough. As time passed, I stopped thinking of him as the son who hurt me. I began to think of him as the son who taught me the value of my own dignity. Because sometimes, the people who break your heart are the same ones who make you find your strength. Without his cruelty, I would have never known my worth. Without that dinner table humiliation, I would have never built the second table. Pain, in its own strange way, had been my teacher. Now my evenings are spent in peace. I sit by the window of my small home, watching the light fade over the rooftops. I listen to the sounds of laughter from the foundation nearby, the women sharing stories, the clinking of spoons, the smell of lentils and bread filling the air. It reminds me that no cruelty lasts forever, but kindness does. Sometimes I look at the photograph on my table, the one of my son as a little boy, sitting on my lap, smiling with missing teeth. That boy still lives somewhere inside the man who grew cruel. I no longer hate him. I just hope one day he forgives himself the way I forgave him. Because guilt, when carried too long, becomes a kind of hunger. And I wouldn't wish that on anyone, not even the person who made me starve. Life has taught me that there are two kinds of hunger, one that comes from the stomach and one that comes from the heart. The first is easy to satisfy. The second takes a lifetime. My son fed his pride until it devoured his heart, and when there was nothing left, he finally understood the difference. I didn't need to teach him anymore. Life took over that lesson for me. Now, when I speak to the younger women who visit the second table, I tell them, never forget your worth. You can forgive, but never forget. Respect is not something you beg for. It's something you live for. They listen quietly, nodding, their faces reflecting the same pain I once carried. I see myself in them, broken but still breathing, and that's enough for me to keep going. Sometimes people ask me if I regret what I did, changing the will, walking away, letting my son face shame. I tell them no, because regret belongs to those who act in anger. I didn't act in anger. I acted in truth. I gave him what he had given me, silence. But mine was not cruel. Mine was cleansing. It gave me back my peace, my pride, and my sense of self. I no longer see myself as a victim. I see myself as a survivor. The world may call it revenge, but I call it balance. When I walk through the shelter now, the women greet me with smiles. They tell me their stories: sons who forgot, daughters who stopped calling, families that vanished when love no longer served them. I listen, and then I tell them, you are not forgotten. You are not alone. The world may move on, but your worth remains. Their eyes shine when I say it, and I know they believe me because I've lived it. In the evenings, I light a candle on my small desk and whisper a prayer. Not for my son to suffer, but for him to find peace. Because forgiveness isn't about freeing someone else. It's about freeing yourself. The night feels softer after that. The air carries the scent of jasmine from the garden below, and I think to myself, this is what freedom smells like. The truth is, every act of cruelty leaves a seed behind, but you can choose what grows from it. I chose peace. He chose silence. And somehow, both of us found what we deserved. Now, I leave you with this, my dear listener. If your child ever looks at you and forgets who you are, if they treat your kindness like weakness, your love like obligation, your care like burden, would you keep serving them from the same plate? Or would you finally serve yourself the peace you deserve? Because sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest lessons, and sometimes the ones who eat last are the ones who end up full. I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. I just needed to remind the world, and my son, that dignity is not dessert. It is the meal itself.